How's it going, Eliminators? Today, we're going to be diagnosing a lawnmower that won't start. So let's get right into it. So I'm working on a Poulan push mower here, and this mower has a Briggs and Stratton Quattro 4 horsepower engine on it. Now the carburetor it uses is one of the plastic carburetors. I have a video showing you guys how to go through and clean one of these carburetors, but the carburetor here isn't going to be the main focus of the video. The main purpose of this video is just going to be why it didn't start when I sprayed carb cleaner into the carburetor. So my customer called me and said that it wouldn't start. And a little history here, I did sell this mower to them about 2 or 3 years ago now. Said it worked fine up until now, but because it's springtime, old fuel sits in the fuel tank and it's just going to gum up the carburetor. Now, the first thing I do on basically any lawnmower that comes in with a no start situation is I'm going to go ahead and pull off the air cover here, and you guys can see the air filter sits on top of there. And I'm going to be taking some carb cleaner, and depending on the type and design of the carburetor, I'm either going to be spraying in right here where the air filter would be, or on this model it's going to be up on the top, and I'm going to be spraying some carb cleaner to try to bypass the carburetor. So by using some carb cleaner and spraying it into the carburetor, you're going to go ahead and give the mower a pull, and generally 9 times out of 10, if it's a gummed up main jet or a gummed up carburetor, your lawnmower, as long as it has spark and compression, is going to fire up. It's going to run for a brief second, and then it's going to shut off. Now, I just did a video on a mower that had that issue. Basically, the main jet was gummed up, but it wasn't completely clogged. So it started, and then it shut right off because it just couldn't get a constant supply of fuel. In the case of this engine, though, I sprayed it with some carburetor cleaner, and I pulled it 5 or 10 times, and it just would not start. Now, like I said, by spraying carb cleaner, you're bypassing the carburetor and essentially putting fuel directly into the cylinder. So you're eliminating the carburetor at that point for your process of elimination. So if you put fuel directly into the cylinder and your mower fires up and then shuts off, then obviously you're going to have a fuel supply issue, gummed up carburetor. Go ahead and clean your carb, and at that point you should be good to go. But like I said, when I sprayed this one and pulled it, it wouldn't start. So the first thing I did was I went down to the spark plug, I removed it, and I noticed that the spark plug here was pretty fouled up. So I went ahead and installed a new spark plug. Now, if you don't know what type of spark plug your machine takes, try to look along the shroud of the engine somewhere, normally on the top cover or on the front, and you'll see a model number, and then you can go ahead and put that model number into a website such as ereplacementparts.com, and then you can look through the parts listing and find what type of spark plug you should be running on your mower. With that being said, though, with the new spark plug in, I gave it another spray of carb cleaner, pulled it again, and it still didn't start. So at that point, I didn't know whether I had spark or not. So I went ahead and disconnected the spark plug boot, and then I connected my spark tester here. This just has a light bulb in it. So you're going to plug that end into your spark plug wire end, and you're going to take that end and plug it onto your spark plug. So you just pull your engine over and you check to see if the bulb lights up. The bulb did light up, which means that we had spark. So now we know that we were getting fuel because I was putting it directly into the cylinder. We're getting spark. So the last thing that I would check in that case would be the compression. Now, normally if you're pulling your pull start handle here, you're going to feel whether or not your machine has compression. But if you have one, go ahead and hook up a compression tester, and then you can go ahead and pull over the engine, and the compression will build inside of the gauge, and you'll be able to get an accurate reading of how much compression your engine is producing, which is going to let you know if your piston rings are sealing up and your valves are closing nice and everything's good to go. This engine, as you guys can see in the picture, was producing about 130, I believe, PSI of compression. So that's well within the acceptable range, which means that we had spark, we had compression, and I was giving it fuel. So why didn't it start? The answer to that question is right here in this glass jar. So you're going to look and see, and we're looking for water in the bottom, and there is no water in the bottom of that jar. So this is all fuel, 100% of it, but it's old fuel. This is probably a year old. And that fuel there was sitting inside of this fuel tank. So while I was spraying carb cleaner into the carburetor, and I know that some of it was going into the cylinder because when I pulled the spark plug was wet and you could smell carb cleaner on it. What was happening was all of that old fuel was diluting the strong, very combustible carb cleaner that I was spraying in there. and simply not allowing combustion to take place. Now, when I pulled the air filter off of this carburetor and I looked inside of there, I saw all kinds of gunk built up in there. So I knew that it needed a carb clean regardless. I knew that it had spark and I knew that it had compression. So I figured that it was just a fuel issue. So the purpose of this video is just going to be a tip that if you spray an engine with carb cleaner or ether or quick start, whatever you want to call it, and it doesn't fire up or it doesn't even sound like it's trying to start up, then you may benefit from removing the carburetor altogether. So once the carburetor was removed, I went to this little tube right here and I just put my finger in there and I tried to move it up and down. This is your intake manifold, and I actually have a video of me replacing one of these because they do crack sometimes. So it could be an issue where you're spraying carb cleaner in, but there's just not enough suction to pull the carb cleaner in because there's a crack in this tube. One of the ways you can see if it's cracked is just go ahead and put your finger in here and try to move it left and right. And if it doesn't make any cracking sound or it doesn't move too much, then you know that you shouldn't need to replace it. So where does that bring us now? Well, because the carburetor and the fuel system was removed, I then took my can of carb cleaner and went ahead and sprayed directly into the intake manifold, then took it outside and pulled it over to see if it would start. Now, before I go ahead and take this mower outside to fire it up, I just want to check the oil, and you guys can see, obviously, it's farther up the dipstick than normal, but that's because this has been flipped up and down to put onto my table, but there is oil in it. So before you fire up an engine, you always want to make sure that there is in fact some oil in it. So at least now I can bring this machine outside and try to get it fired up. Now, in theory, the engine should fire right up, but because we don't have a source of fuel, the engine should shut off afterwards. So I'm just going to go ahead and spray it, and then we'll go ahead and pull it, and it should fire right up. There we go. So at least we know that this engine will run once the carburetor is installed with some fresh fuel in it. So we're back in the shop now, and we know that the engine fired right up with the fresh carb cleaner sprayed into the cylinder. So that says that what was happening was the old fuel was diluting that carb cleaner. So it was just so broken down, it probably didn't even have enough octane rating to even start the combustion process, because originally when I was spraying it, it didn't even sound like it was trying to start. So that's why I thought it was no spark. But now that all of that is done, I can go ahead and reinstall the carburetor, put a new air filter on it. And again, if you guys want to see how I clean one of these carburetors, I will link that video in the top right of your screen, as well as in the description down below. Then what I'm going to do is put a very small amount of fuel in it, just so that I can take it outside, fire it up, and run it for a bit to warm up the oil. I'll go ahead and do an oil change, and then once the gas is ran out of it and the oil has been drained out of it, then I can go flip it upside down and then scrape out all of the grass that's built up underneath the mower deck. Basically, I'm going to be doing a full service on this mower. I'll sharpen the blade as well, because I haven't had this back in my shop for, I'm going to say, about 2 or 3 years since I sold it, so it is in need of a little bit of TLC. So we got the mower outside. The deck has been cleaned up. We've scraped the underside of the deck, undercoated it, sharpened the blade. We have fresh oil and fresh fuel, so let's see if it fires up. So that wraps up today's video. If you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week, check channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.